At my son's lavish housewarming party on a chilly November evening, my wife suddenly grabbed my wrist and whispered, "We have to leave. Right now." I looked around the elegant living room full of smiling guests and asked, "Why, what happened?" She forced a smile until we reached the car. Then she locked every door, turned to me with trembling hands and whispered, "You didn't see them bow when he entered that room, did you?" What I discovered that night destroyed everything I believed about my family. This story starts quietly, but it won't leave you unchanged. Before we dive in, drop a quick comment for me. What's the weather like where you are right now? Your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. Just a quick note. Some details in this story have been adapted to emphasize the lesson. What truly matters is the message it carries. At my son's housewarming party, Willa gripped my arm hard enough to leave marks and whispered words that would shatter 40 years of fatherhood. But that came later. First there was the house. We arrived at 7 p.m. on a Saturday in early November, pulling into the circular driveway of Silas's new place on the Geist Reservoir in Fishers, Indiana. The house was immaculate modern glass and steel, catching the last orange light of sunset landscaping, so precise it looked computer-generated. I'm Luther Prescott, 68 years old, retired insurance fraud investigator, who spent 35 years reading liars for a living. Standing on that pristine walkway, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: genuine dread. Willa, my wife of 40 years, and the sharpest investigative partner I ever worked with, squeezed my hand as we approached the front door. At 68, she still had the instincts that made her invaluable during fraud cases, the ability to sense wrongness before the evidence materialized. Her grip told me she felt it too. Silas opened the door before we could knock. Our 38-year-old son stood backlit in the foyer, wearing an expensive charcoal suit and a smile I recognized instantly from 3 decades of interrogations, practiced flawless and completely hollow. That recognition hit me like cold water. "Sha, Mom, Dad, I'm so glad you could make it," he said, embracing Willa first, then me. His hug was textbook perfect, 3 seconds appropriate pressure release. "Welcome to our new home," Willa asked. The community," Silas clarified smoothly. "Several of us purchased it together as a shared space." Inside, 40 young adults filled the living room in unnatural silence. Ages ranged from early 20s to mid-30s. No music, no laughter, no alcohol anywhere I checked. They sat in clusters on pristine furniture, conversing in hushed tones, but every few seconds their eyes would drift to Silas. Not casual glances. Something else. Reverence. I've seen corporate teams show deference to powerful executives. I've seen families defer to wealthy patriarchs. This was neither. This was worship. "Can I get you something to drink?" Silas gestured toward the kitchen. "We have sparkling water, herbal tea, pressed juices." "Just water," I said. While Silas stepped away, I scanned the room with investigators' eyes. The guests wore similar muted colors: grays, tans, soft blues. No logos, no jewelry except simple watches. 3 women in the corner spoke in whispers, but when one laughed, the others immediately shushed her. She went silent, face flushing with what looked like shame. Willa leaned close. "Luther, something is wrong here. Very wrong." Silas returned with 2 glasses of water, his smile never wavering. He introduced us to several guests' names I immediately forgot, because I was cataloging micro-expressions instead. Each person who shook my hand exhibited the same tells: dilated pupils, slightly elevated breathing, hyper-awareness of Silas's position in the room. In 35 years of investigating fraud, I learned one thing: when everything looks too perfect, someone is hiding something very ugly. "Silas, this is quite a gathering," I said carefully. "What's the occasion?" just celebrating new beginnings. His eyes held mine a beat too long. Fresh starts, leaving behind old structures that no longer serve us. The phrasing felt rehearsed, scripted. At 8:15, Willa excused herself to find the bathroom. I watched her climb the curved staircase to the second floor, then turned back to observe the room. A young man, maybe 25, approached Silas and whispered something. Silas nodded, touched the man's shoulder, and the gesture produced a visible reaction. The young man's entire body relaxed, as if he'd received benediction. When did the boy I taught to ride a bicycle become a stranger who smiles with his mouth, but not his eyes? I thought about the Silas I remembered, brilliant child, full scholarship, to Northwestern dual degree in organizational psychology and business management. We'd been proud. Distant maybe, I worked 60-hour weeks during his childhood, Willa managing the investigative firm's operations, while I chased fraud cases across the Midwest. But proud. When had we lost him? Or had we ever really known him at all? 15 minutes passed. Willa hadn't returned. I was about to go look for her when she appeared at the top of the stairs. Her face was bloodless complexion, pale as winter sky. She descended slowly, gripping the railing, and made her way through the crowd without making eye contact with anyone. When she reached me, her hand found my elbow with desperate strength. "We need to leave," she whispered. "Right now." "What happened? Not here." Her eyes darted toward Silas, who was watching us from across the room with that same perfect smile. "Make an excuse." "Any excuse." I started to move toward the door, but Willa pulled me back. "Wait. I need to show you something first. Follow me. Don't let anyone see." She led me through the kitchen, past the gleaming countertops and commercial-grade appliances, to a hallway near the back of the house, a coat closet door slightly ajar. She pulled me inside, leaving a 2-inch crack to peer through. "What are we—" "Shh." Her finger pressed against my lips. "Just watch." Through the crack, I could see into what appeared to be a side parlor. Young adults filed in, silently forming concentric circles. Silas entered last, and when he did, every head bowed. Not a casual nod. Full supplication. His voice changed. No longer the warm host. Something else. Sermonic. "We gather in preparation." Silas said, his voice carrying absolute authority. "The one has shown us clarity. Soon purification day will come, and the infidels will understand their place in the design." The group responded in unison, "We serve the design." In all my years investigating criminal minds, I had never felt fear like this, because this time the suspect was my own blood. Willa's hand trembled as she gripped my sleeve. She leaned close, her voice barely audible above the soft chanting now drifting from the parlor. "Get into the closet right now," she whispered. "If you still trust me after 40 years, don't ask questions." Through the 2-inch gap in the closet door, I watched my son distribute white pills to 12 people who knelt before him like disciples before a prophet. Willa's breathing was shallow beside me in the darkness. We'd wedged ourselves between winter coats that smelled like cedar and mothballs, our knees pressed against cardboard boxes, necks craned to see through the crack. The second-floor closet overlooked what Silas had called the meditation room, a space I now understood was something else entirely. The 12 individuals formed a perfect circle on the hardwood floor. Heads bowed, palms upturned. They ranged in age from early 20s to perhaps 40. Silas stood at the center, backlit by recessed lighting, holding a small wooden box. "Titatitu, these purifiers will cleanse your minds of doubt," he said, his voice carrying the same sermonic authority I'd heard earlier. "The one requires absolute clarity for what comes on Purification Day." He moved clockwise around the circle, placing a single white pill in each person's palm. They consumed them immediately, without water, without hesitation. My investigator's mind cataloged details, pharmaceutical-grade, uniform-size, likely prescription compounds. Someone with medical access was supplying these. Grace, Silas said, addressing a young woman with auburn hair. You will target the university campus. The new intake begins next week. We need 12 more by December 1st. Yes, Apex, she whispered. Apex. The title landed like a stone in my chest. Lucas. Silas continued, turning to a man in his 30s wearing wire-rimmed glasses. The financial transfer must be completed by Wednesday. No delays. The Cayman account cannot remain dormant. Understood, Apex. Dr. Greer increased the dosages by 0.5 milligrams. Some are showing residual independent thought. That cannot continue. A woman I hadn't noticed before, mid-50s, professional bearing, nodded. I'll adjust the prescriptions tomorrow. Prescriptions. Legally obtained psychotropic compounds distributed under the guise of medical treatment. I had spent 35 years dismantling organizations exactly like this, hierarchical, disciplined, built on control and fear disguised as enlightenment. Insurance fraud had taught me to recognize the architecture of deception. This was textbook, a charismatic leader, chemical dependency, isolation from outside networks, coded language creating insider-outsider boundaries. But this wasn't some distant criminal I'd never met. This was the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle. Silas continued assigning tasks with military precision. Financial transfers, recruitment targets, supply chain logistics. Each instruction delivered with calm authority, each response flavored with absolute obedience. When he finished, the circle rose in unison. We serve the design, they chanted. The design is clarity, Silas responded. Clarity is submission. Submission is freedom. The call and response made my skin crawl. I'd heard variations of this script 100 times in depositions, in wiretapped recordings, in confessions. Cult indoctrination follows patterns, and Silas had clearly studied them. How does a father reconcile the boy who cried at scraped knees with the man calmly distributing mind-altering drugs to a room of silent believers? I couldn't. The two images refused to merge. Instead, they existed in parallel, the memory of childhood Silas reading on the couch, with his legs tucked under him, and the reality of adult Silas orchestrating pharmaceutical control over human minds. Somewhere between those two versions, I'd lost my son. Or perhaps I'd never known him at all. The ritual ended at 9:45. The group filed out silently, returning to the main party as if nothing had happened. Silas remained behind, studying a leather-bound ledger. After 2 minutes, he closed it, tucked it under his arm, and left. Willa and I waited 5 full minutes in the closet before moving. When we finally emerged, my knees ached and my shirt was soaked with sweat despite the air conditioning. We have to leave, Willa whispered. Right now. Before he realizes, we have to act normal, I interrupted. If we run, he'll know we saw something. We leave like tired parents who stayed too long at a boring party. She nodded, but her hands trembled as she smoothed her blouse. We descended the stairs, slowly forcing casual expressions. The main party had thinned, maybe 20 people remained scattered in small clusters. Silas stood near the kitchen, the leather ledger nowhere in sight, his public smile back in place. I approached him, manufacturing the exhausted father performance I'd practiced 1,000 times with uncooperative witnesses. Son, we're going to head out. It's been a long day and your mother is feeling tired. Silas turned, and for 1 microsecond something flickered behind his eyes. Calculation, assessment, measurement. Then the warmth returned. Of course, Dad. Drive safely. He embraced Willa, then me. I'm glad you could see the new place. It's beautiful, I lied. You've done well. We all contribute, he said. That's the beauty of community. As we walked to the door, I felt his gaze on my back, not the casual attention of a host seeing off guests, but something sharper, predatory. I'd felt that kind of scrutiny before, usually from across an interrogation table. The November air hit us like cold water when we stepped outside. Willa gripped my hand as we crossed the driveway to our car. Neither of us spoke until I'd started the engine and pulled through the gates. Then she started shaking, full-body tremors that made her teeth chatter. "Luther," she managed. "Luther, what did we just see?" "A cult," I said flatly. "A pharmaceutical dependency operation masquerading as a spiritual community. Probably 100 members, maybe more. Financial infrastructure, medical supply chain, recruitment targets. Our son." Yes. For the first time in my career, I was not hunting a stranger, I was running from my own blood. We drove in silence for 10 minutes, streetlights strobing across Willa's pale face. When we stopped at a red light, she turned to me and I saw something in her expression I'd never seen in 40 years of marriage, pure terror. "Did you see the way he looked at us?" she asked. I had seen it. The same calculating gaze I'd witnessed in hundreds of criminals across 3 decades. The look of someone assessing threat level, running scenarios, deciding whether to neutralize a problem before it metastasized. For the first time in 35 years of investigating, I felt like I was the one being hunted. I nodded in the darkness of the car. Yes, I had seen the way Silas looked at us, the cold calculation of a predator measuring distance to prey. The question wasn't whether he suspected something. The question was how much time we had before he acted on that suspicion. Sleep was impossible. At 2 in the morning, I did the only thing that made sense. I opened the boxes containing 35 years of hunting liars and began building a file on my own son. My home office in Carmel still held every major case I'd worked, organized chronologically in bankers' boxes, stacked floor to ceiling along the north wall. Insurance fraud, embezzlement, identity theft, organized crime posing as legitimate business. 35 years of methodology, documentation, pattern recognition. I'd taught seminars on behavioral profiling, written articles for investigative journals, testified as an expert witness in 43 trials, and I'd missed the fact that my son was running a cult. I pulled down a fresh legal pad and wrote at the top, "Subject Silas Prescott." The word subject created necessary distance. Not son, not my boy, subject, target of investigation. Once I framed it that way, the professional training kicked in. Age 38. Occupation claims consulting, specifics unknown. Relationship status married to Astrid Prescott 3 years. Financial status, sudden wealth source unclear. Behavioral anomalies, personality shift, beginning approximately 3 years ago, increased isolation from family, new social network, with no overlap to previous contacts. Acquisition of property valued at $2.3 million, despite claimed income inconsistent with asset accumulation. I worked backward through memories, constructing a timeline. When had I last had a genuine conversation with Silas? Not the surface pleasantries we exchanged at obligatory holiday dinners, but actual communication. I couldn't remember. 2 years, 3. This is the worst professional blind spot of my career. I didn't see the signs because I refused to look. I pulled down boxes from 2015 through 2023, searching for any case with similar organizational patterns. Pharmaceutical dependency, hierarchical control, coded language, financial infrastructure. The combination was specific enough that if I'd investigated something similar, I'd have documentation. At 4:15 a.m. I found it. A manila folder marked Hayes Victor, 2015, unresolved. I'd worked it as a consulting expert for the prosecution. Victor Hayes, 42 at the time, had been charged with running a coercive organization that used prescription medications to maintain psychological control over approximately 60 members. The case had fallen apart when 3 key witnesses recanted testimony. Charges dropped. Hayes disappeared. I read my own notes from 8 years ago. Subject exhibits classic narcissistic control patterns. Uses pharmaceutical dependency legally prescribed via compromised medical professionals to create physiological need. Members exhibit trauma bonding loss of autonomous decision-making capacity and fear responses inconsistent with voluntary participation. Recommend federal investigation into medical licensing board. The methodology matched what I'd witnessed in Silas's house exactly. Last known location, Midwest region, specifics unknown. Status unresolved. I had built my entire career on reading what people tried to hide, and for 3 years I had refused to read my own son. The realization didn't land as shock. It landed as cold, spreading certainty. Silas hadn't invented this structure. He'd learned it, either from Hayes directly or from someone who'd studied the same playbook. I made notes until 6 a.m., then tried to sleep. Failed. At 9:30, I told Willa I was going back to the house. Why? Her face was still pale from the previous night. I left something there. I lied. My reading glasses. She understood immediately. Be careful. I timed my arrival for 10 a.m. early enough that Silas would likely be elsewhere late enough to seem casual. The Geist Reservoir house looked different in daylight. Less architectural showcase, more fortified compound. Security cameras at every corner. Reinforced doors. Landscaping designed to eliminate blind spots. I rang the bell. Astrid Prescott answered the door, and I understood instantly why Silas had kept her away from family gatherings. She was 35, but looked 50. Pale skin stretched over sharp cheekbones. Hollow eyes ringed with dark circles so deep they looked like bruises. She moved with unnatural lethargy, the chemical slowness I'd seen in dozens of psychologically controlled victims over 3 decades. Her clothes hung loose, suggesting recent weight loss. When she spoke, her affect was flat voice, barely above a whisper. Mr. Prescott, Astrid, I think I left my reading glasses here last night. Mind if I take a quick look around? Silas isn't home. She said it like a warning and a confession simultaneously. He's at a meeting. I'll just be a moment. She stepped aside mechanically. I walked through the foyer, scanning for cameras, found 3 visible, likely more hidden. I made a show of checking the living room, then returned to the entrance where Astrid stood motionless. I kept my voice conversational, aware we were being recorded. Guess I left them somewhere else. How are you settling into the new place? Fine. The word carried no inflection. We should have you and Silas over for dinner sometime. It's been too long since we've really talked. Something flickered behind her eyes, brief, desperate, immediately suppressed. I pulled out my wallet, removed a business card, wrote a number on the back. Here's my cell. If you ever need anything, and I mean anything, day or night, you can reach me at this number. I emphasized the last part slightly. No questions asked. Her hand trembled as she took the card. She stared at it for 3 seconds, then nodded once. Looking at Astrid's hollow eyes, I realized this investigation wasn't just about my son anymore. It was about everyone trapped in his orbit. I turned toward the door, mind, already cataloging what I'd seen: pharmaceutical dependency indicators, isolation, surveillance, infrastructure, physical deterioration, consistent with long-term psychological abuse. As I reached for the handle, Astrid called out softly, "Mr. Prescott." I turned back. She looked at me for a single second, and in that moment, her eyes said everything her mouth couldn't. Fear. Desperation. A silent scream trapped behind chemical sedation and constant monitoring. Then she shook her head. No. It's nothing. But her eyes had already told me the truth. She was a prisoner, and she knew I was her only chance. I drove home from Silas's house with Astrid's desperate eyes burned into my memory. She couldn't speak. Too much surveillance, too much control, but her silence had communicated everything. Now I had two parallel problems: saving my daughter-in-law and understanding what my son was building. 3 days later, Willa handed me her phone with trembling fingers and said 5 words that stopped my heart. I photographed what he held. We were in my office. November afternoon, light slanted through the blinds, striping the desk where I'd laid out my growing investigation file. Willa's face was pale, and I noticed she hadn't slept well. The dark circles matched my own. When I asked, "One in the closet?" While you were watching Silas distribute the pills, I used my phone. No flash, no sound. I didn't even know if the images would be usable in that darkness. She tapped the screen. I didn't look at them until this morning. I was too afraid of what I'd see. She handed me the phone. The first image showed the ritual from our hidden vantage point, grainy, dark, but visible. Silas stood in the circle's center, the 12 disciples kneeling. But it was the third photograph that made my blood stop. Silas held a document. Single page. White paper. Even in the low light, Willa's camera had captured enough detail that when I zoomed in, text became legible. Header typed in capital letters, Purification List, December 15th. Below it, 63 names arranged in numbered columns. I sat down slowly. Luther. Willa's voice seemed to come from far away. I zoomed in further, reading names. Some I didn't recognize. Others triggered faint memories, people Silas had mentioned years ago, college friends, former colleagues. Entry number 7 caught my eye, Marcus Holloway, age 24. "This isn't a membership roster," I said quietly. Willa sank into the chair across from me. "I know. It's a termination list." She nodded. Her hands were shaking. I pulled up my calendar. November 8th. December 15th was 37 days away. Wadiangsu, what does purification mean in cult terminology? Willa asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. Elimination of threats. Cleansing the organization of anyone who might expose it, resist it, or dilute its ideological purity. I'd seen it before in cult case files. Victor Hayes had used similar language. These 63 people are either defectors, potential whistleblowers, or individuals Silas considers obstacles to whatever he's planning for that date. We have to call the police. And tell them what? That our son held a piece of paper at a private party, that we suspect he's planning something, but have no evidence of an actual crime. Luther, there are 63 names. I know. I stared at the photograph. But law enforcement needs proof of imminent threat. A list of names isn't enough. They'll ask, has anyone on this list been harmed? Has Silas made explicit threats? Has he acquired weapons without answers? This is speculation. I had investigated hundreds of fraud cases in my career, but I had never investigated a case where every day delayed meant a body dropped. Willa wiped her eyes. So what do? We monitor. We document. We find evidence that connects Silas to actionable criminal activity. I pulled out a fresh notebook. And we start tracking every name on this list. If anything happens to any of them, we establish the pattern. 37 days, Willa whispered. I nodded. 37 days. We spent the next 4 days building infrastructure. I created a digital database with all 63 names cross-referenced against public records, social media, last known addresses. Willa set up automated news alerts for each name. I configured police scanner monitoring for the Fishers and Indianapolis area. The work gave me something to do, besides think about Astrid's hollow eyes. On November 12th, 1 week after the housewarming party, I was monitoring local news feeds when a breaking story appeared on Channel 8. Authorities are investigating the death of 24-year-old Marcus Holloway, found deceased in his residence on the city's northeast side. Preliminary reports suggest suicide. Holloway was reportedly experiencing financial difficulties and had recently ended a long-term relationship. No foul play is suspected at this time. The name hit me like voltage. I pulled up Willa's photograph, zoomed to entry number 7. Marcus Holloway, age 24. Perfect match. My hands went cold. I called Willa into the office. "What's wrong?" She saw my face and stopped. I pointed at the television screen, then at the photograph on my computer monitor. Entry number 7. 24 years old. Dead. Her hand covered her mouth. "The list isn't a future projection," I said quietly. "It's being executed right now, running parallel to whatever Silas is preparing for the 15th. How many others?" Willa's voice was barely audible. "We don't know. This is entry 7, which means potentially 6 others are already dead, but we weren't monitoring until now. No way to know if they died before the party or after." I opened my database, began marking Holloway's name with a red flag. "What we do know is that Silas has a system for making murders look like suicides, accidents, or natural causes." "Sterling Hulme," Willa said suddenly. "What was at the party?" Silas mentioned someone named Sterling was handling logistics coordination. I remember because it sounded like a corporate title, but the way he said it felt wrong. I made a note. Sterling, logistics, likely the operational enforcer handling eliminations. "No, we need to call the FBI," Willa said. "This is beyond us." Not yet. We have one data point connecting Silas to this list, a photograph of a document, and one death that matches. That's not enough for federal intervention. They'll ask for more. We need to establish pattern, demonstrate organizational structure, prove intent. How many more have to die before we have enough proof? The question hung in the air like smoke. I called Willa into closer and pointed at the name on the television screen, then at entry number 7 on our enhanced photograph. 62 people left, I said quietly. And we don't know who is next. The worst part was knowing that somewhere in this city, entries 1 through 6 were likely already dead, and we had no idea which names, which families, which lives Silas had already erased, while I'd been too blind to see what my son had become. For 3 days after discovering Marcus Holloway's death, I monitored news feeds, obsessively waiting to identify the next victim. Sleep came in 2-hour fragments. Willa and I took shifts watching the database, cross-referencing obituaries, scanning police reports. We were losing a race we couldn't control. Then the burner phone rang. 11:40 p.m., 10 days after the housewarming party. I was in my office, half asleep over case files, when the cheap prepaid cell buzzed across the desk. Unknown number. I answered on the second ring. Astrid's voice came through in a whisper so faint I had to press the phone against my ear. The basement. "Astrid. Silas left for a meeting. You have maybe 30 minutes. Her breathing was ragged. The basement. "Come now or don't come at all." The line went dead. I was already moving, grabbing my jacket, shouting for Willa. She appeared in the hallway, saw my face, and ran for her shoes without asking questions. We were in the car. 60 seconds later, Willa driving while I called Silas's number to confirm. It rang 4 times before voicemail. His recorded message, smooth and professional, told me to leave a call back. Good enough. He wasn't home. What did she say? Willa asked, accelerating through a yellow light. The basement. Is she hurt? I don't know. But she sounded terrified. We made the drive to Fisher's in 18 minutes. Willa killed the headlights 2 blocks out and coasted to the curb 3 houses down from Silas's property. November night air bit through my jacket as we approached on foot, staying in shadow. The house was dark, except for exterior security lights. No cars in the driveway. I'd brought bolt cutters from my trunk. 35 years of investigations taught me to keep tools for forced entry. Willa carried a flashlight and her phone with 911 pre-dialed, ready to press send if we encountered security. We circled to the rear entrance. The basement door was external, tucked beneath the deck-weathered wood, with a simple padlock. Too simple for a man as meticulous as Silas, unless he wanted it to look unsecured. I cut the padlock in 2 seconds. The door swung inward on silent hinges, revealing concrete steps descending into darkness. "Astrid," I called softly. No response. We descended. Willa's flashlight beam swept across unfinished concrete walls, exposed ductwork mechanical systems. The smell hit me halfway down mildew, human waste, something sour and chemical I couldn't identify. Then the flashlight found her. Astrid sat against the far wall, chained to a structural support column by a heavy ankle restraint. The chain allowed maybe 6 feet of movement. A thin mattress lay on the floor beside her. A plastic bucket in the corner. No bathroom. No privacy. She looked up into the light, raising one skeletal arm to shield her eyes. Bruises lined both arms in distinctive patterns. Fingerprints, grip marks. Her face was gaunt cheekbones, sharp beneath skin that looked translucent in the flashlight beam. She'd lost maybe 20 pounds since the party. Her clothes hung loose, stained with dirt, and worse. "Oh, God!" Willa breathed. I crossed the basement in 4 strides, dropping to my knees beside Astrid. Up close, I could see the ankle restraint had rubbed her skin raw. Dried blood crusted the metal edges. "How long?" I asked. "Does it matter?" Her voice was hoarse, damaged. "Long enough to know what he really is." In 35 years of investigation, I had witnessed human cruelty in every form: financial predators who destroyed families, con artists who preyed on the elderly, corporate fraudsters who bankrupted employees. But this was my son's basement, and that was my daughter-in-law chained to his wall. I positioned the bolt cutters around the chain's weakest link, not the restraint itself, which would require an angle grinder, but the connection point to the wall mount. The metal was thick, designed to hold. "This will be loud," I warned. "Do it," Astrid said. I put my full weight into the handles. The cutters bit deep. The chain resisted, then gave with a sharp crack that echoed through the basement like a gunshot. Willa monitored the stairs phone, ready. "Again," Astrid urged. Second cut. Third. On the 4th attempt, the chain separated completely. The sound of metal hitting concrete reverberated through the space as the severed chain clattered to the floor. Astrid collapsed forward, and Willa caught her before she hit the ground. "Can you walk?" Willa asked. "I don't know." Astrid's voice broke. "I haven't stood in 3 days." I lifted her, she weighed almost nothing, and carried her toward the stairs. The ankle restraint remained locked around her leg chain, trailing behind us. We'd deal with it later. Right now, we needed distance. Willa led the way up and out. Cold November air hit us like salvation. I could feel Astrid shaking in my arms, whether from cold or shock or relief, I couldn't tell. We reached the car. Willa had already started the engine heat, running full blast. I laid Astrid across the back seat and climbed in beside her while Willa drove. 3 blocks, 5, 10. Only when we'd put 2 miles between us and that house did I feel my heartbeat slow. Astrid sat up slowly, pulling the emergency blanket Willa kept in the trunk around her shoulders. She stared out the window at passing streetlights, not speaking. "We're taking you to a hospital," Willa said from the driver's seat. "No." Astrid's voice was firm despite its weakness. "No hospitals, no police, not yet." "Astrid, you need medical attention. Well, what I need is for you to listen." She turned to face me, and her eyes held something I'd seen in witnesses before: the terrible clarity of someone who's survived something unspeakable and knows the world needs to hear it. "You think you know what Silas is," she said quietly. "You've seen the ritual. You found the list. You know about the pills and the control and the meeting schedule." I nodded. "You don't know anything about your son yet," she whispered, gripping my arm with surprising strength. "Nothing at all. Her eyes held knowledge that made the ritual, the hit list, even the chains, look like surface wounds. "Then tell me," I said, and sitting in our car as Willa drove us towards safety, Astrid began to talk, and every word rewrote everything I thought I understood about the boy I'd raised. By the time we reached my house in Carmel, Astrid had stopped shaking. Willa settled her on the living room couch with thick blankets and hot tea while I locked every door and closed every blind. The ankle restraint still circled her leg. We'd need bolt cutters with finer precision to remove it without damaging tissue. Safe in my living room at midnight, wrapped in those blankets and holding tea that steamed in the lamplight, Astrid began the testimony that would transform my son from cult leader into murderer. "I met Silas 4 years ago," she said. Her voice was steadier now, gaining strength with each word. "November 2019. I was working administrative support at a wellness retreat in Bloomington. He attended a weekend seminar. Charming, brilliant, talking about enlightenment and community building and finding purpose beyond materialism." Willa sat beside her, one hand on Astrid's shoulder. Victor Hayes led the group then. Astrid continued. "The founder. Charismatic mid-40s former psychology professor. He'd escaped prosecution in Indiana back in 2015. Charges collapsed when witnesses recanted and quietly rebuilt the organization under a new identity in the Hamilton County area. By the time Silas found him, Hayes had grown the network to maybe 200 members. Silas was just Tier 2. Enthusiastic disciple, nothing more. I'd heard this pattern before in cult formation testimonies. Charismatic founder, hierarchical structure, gradual radicalization. Silas and I married in 2020. He said he wanted me outside the organization so I could maintain perspective, keep him grounded." She laughed bitterly. "I believed him." "When did things change?" Willa asked quietly. Astrid stared into her tea. "October 2021. Victor fell down the headquarters stairs. Concrete steps. 40 of them leading from the main assembly hall to the basement archive. He was found at the bottom with a broken neck. Dead instantly. My investigator instincts activated immediately. Witnesses, none. It happened after a late meeting. Victor had stayed behind to review documents. Silas discovered the body the next morning, and Silas took control. Within 48 hours, Astrid finished. No hesitation, no period of mourning, no transition committee. He convened the Tier 3 Council, announced that Victor had prepared succession documents naming him as heir, and assumed absolute command. The documents were never shown to anyone outside the council. I'd investigated insurance fraud cases built on less suspicious timing. "You think he killed Victor?" I said. It wasn't a question. Astrid met my eyes. "I know he did. I asked him directly 6 months after the funeral. We were alone in the house, the Geist property he'd purchased with money that appeared from nowhere. I said the timing felt wrong. That statistical coincidence only stretches so far. That Victor was 52 and healthy and had no history of falls. What did he say? Nothing. He looked at me the way you'd look at a broken tool. No anger, no defensiveness. Just assessment. Like he was calculating whether I was a problem he could fix or one he needed to eliminate." She pulled the blanket tighter. 3 days later, I woke up in that basement with a chain around my ankle. That was 6 months ago. How does a father process the words, "Your son is a murderer," when they come from the daughter-in-law he just unchained from a basement wall? I didn't sleep that night. Willa set up Astrid in the guest bedroom and sat with her until she finally collapsed from exhaustion around 3 a.m. I stayed in my office updating the investigation file with Astrid's testimony cross-referencing dates. Victor Hayes. Died October 2021. The case file I'd pulled from my archives dated from 2015, 6 years before his death. He'd escaped conviction then, but someone had finished what the courts couldn't. Silas, my son, murderer. The next morning, Willa and I sat at the kitchen table while Astrid slept upstairs. Weak November sunlight filtered through the windows. Coffee cooled in our cups untouched. "We need to call the police," Willa said. "Federal authorities, FBI, someone." Statitu. With what evidence? A photograph of a list Astrid's testimony that she suspects Silas killed a man whose death was ruled accidental 2 years ago. She was chained in a basement, which we can't prove without involving local authorities. And the moment we do, Astrid appeared in the doorway wearing Willa's spare clothes. She looked slightly more human after sleep, though the gauntness remained. "You can't go to the local police," she said, moving to the table. "Detective Knox Bentley. He handles the Northwest sector. He's one of them." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "Explain." Tier 3 member. Has been for 4 years. He erases records, monitors investigations that might threaten the organization, feeds intelligence directly back to Silas. Astrid poured herself coffee with shaking hands. "Any report you file with Indianapolis Metro or Fishers PD will cross his desk within 24 hours. He'll bury it, and you'll disappear." Willa looked at me. "Then we go federal. Skip the locals entirely." "And say what?" I asked. "That we suspect a cult is operating but can't prove it. Because the evidence is circumstantial, federal offices don't mobilize on suspicion. They need probable cause. Documented criminal activity. Bodies. Marcus Holloway is a body," Willa said. "Ina ruled a suicide by the same police department we just learned is compromised." Astrid leaned forward. "So what do we do?" I looked at both of them, my wife of 40 years, and the daughter-in-law I'd rescued from a basement. "We build the case ourselves. I have contacts. People who owe me favors from 35 years of investigations. Private sector, law enforcement, corporate security. We gather proof, first hard evidence that connects Silas to criminal activity federal authorities can't ignore. Then we go to the FBI. But we go to Chicago or Cincinnati offices, not Indiana. We bypass every local connection." "How long?" Astrid asked. "As long as it takes." "We don't have as long as it takes," Willa said quietly. "We have 34 days. Later that morning, I stood before the bathroom mirror, calculating the timeline with the same methodical precision I'd used for 3 decades of fraud cases. December 15th minus today's date, November 16th. 34 days. I looked at my reflection, a 68-year-old man who had spent a career hunting criminals, now hunting his own blood. 34 days to build an airtight case against a murderer who had an entire police department in his pocket, who controlled 3,000 believers across 12 states, and who happened to carry my last name. 34 days wasn't much time to dismantle an empire, but I'd built investigations on tighter timelines before. The difference was that those investigations had never involved family. I started making calls that same afternoon, activating contacts I'd accumulated over 3 decades, people who owed favors or simply remembered when I'd helped them. The woman sitting across from me in the corner booth of a highway diner 3 days later had escaped my son's cult 6 months ago, and she was about to hand me the blueprint of his entire empire. Thea Mercer, 29. A former Tier 2 disciple who'd defected in May, sat with the haunted eyes of someone who'd seen the inside of the machine and barely escaped. I'd found her through my archived insurance fraud claims database. She'd filed a medical claim after leaving listing injuries that raised flags, minor burns, malnutrition, psychological trauma coded as anxiety disorder. The diner was 40 minutes outside Indianapolis, chosen for its isolation and lack of security cameras. Breakfast crowd had cleared. We had the back corner to ourselves. "Thank you for meeting me," I said. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. You said this was about Silas Prescott. He's my son. Her expression shifted surprise, then sympathy, then something darker. I'm sorry. Oh, don't be. Just tell me what I need to know. Thea took a breath. 4 tiers. That's how the organization works. Tier 1 is Silas and maybe 5 others, the inner circle. They make all strategic decisions. Tier 2 are operatives. People like I was. We recruited managed logistics, ran the safe houses. Tier 3 are enforcers and protectors, cops, lawyers, medical professionals who shield the organization from outside interference. Tier 4 are the believers, the disciples. They don't know how deep it goes. I made notes on a pocket pad. How many total, when I left 6 months ago? Maybe 800 active locally. But the network is bigger, much bigger. I heard rumors of branches in Montana, Arizona, Nevada. Silas visits them quarterly. 800. The number made my chest tighten. The indoctrination compound, I said. Where is it? Hamilton County, Indiana. Rural area maybe 20 miles northeast of Carmel. Legally registered as Sunrise Psychological Wellness Center. State-licensed mental health facility. That's the genius of it. Everything appears legitimate until you look close. And the safe houses, Thea pulled a folded paper from her jacket. I wrote down what I remember. 12 locations across 3 states. Apartments, storage units, a farm property in Michigan. They rotate people through them to prevent anyone from building external relationships. I studied the list. Addresses, dates, capacity estimates. Why did you leave? I asked. Her hands tightened on the coffee cup. Because I realized I was recruiting people to their deaths. Not all at once. Slowly. Through dependency. Through isolation. Through pills that made them forget they'd ever wanted to leave. She met my eyes. Your son is very good at making people disappear while convincing them they're being saved. I had spent my career tracking fraud schemes that cost millions, but I had never tracked one that enslaved minds. Before she left, Thea gripped my hand across the table. Mr. Prescott, be careful. Not because they'll attack you, they won't, not directly, but because they'll make you believe you're winning, right up until the moment you lose. That's how Silas works. He lets you think you're hunting him while he's 3 moves ahead, and by the time you realize it, the trap has already closed. That afternoon, I connected via encrypted video with Finn Rawlings, 32, a cybersecurity specialist I'd sourced through old professional contacts. He appeared on my computer screen in my home office background, deliberately blurred, wearing a headset. Mr. Prescott, he said. I have what you asked for. Walk me through it. Finn's fingers moved across an off-screen keyboard. My monitor populated with financial documents. I traced the shell company payments you flagged. Horizon Behavioral Systems, LLC. Corporate disbursements flow to multiple recipients, but one stands out. Dr. Elena Greer, 52, psychiatrist licensed in Indiana and Illinois. She's receiving irregular payments totaling about $30,000 monthly. For what? Prescriptions. Massive volume. I breached her patient management system legally through public insurance claim data and found 847 active patient profiles. But here's the problem, the names are fake. Ghost identities with real DEA numbers. Someone created a parallel prescription pipeline using stolen medical credentials. My blood went cold. What's she prescribing? Benzodiazepines. SSRIs. Antipsychotics in some cases. Dosages that would sedate a horse. All filled through pharmacies that don't cross-check patient histories too carefully. 847 people, I said slowly. Finn nodded. All verified cult disciples based on the names you provided from your daughter-in-law's intelligence. Dr. Greer is chemically controlling them. Federal drug distribution violation under Title 21 U.S.C. Section 841, unauthorized distribution for non-medical purposes. This is prosecutable. 847 names. 847 human beings swallowing pills without knowing those chemicals were rewriting their neurology, making them compliant, erasing resistance. Can you send me the full roster? I asked. Already encrypted and sent to your secure drive. I opened the file after Finn disconnected. Names scrolled across my screen in alphabetical order. Some I recognized from Thea's intelligence. Others were complete strangers. All of them were being poisoned under the guise of treatment. And somewhere in that list, I knew were names from the purification roster. People Silas intended to kill, but first he was making sure they'd be too chemically sedated to fight back, too cognitively impaired, to seek help, too dependent on the very pills that were destroying them. I stared at the roster glowing on my computer screen, 847 names, and asked the question that would haunt me for weeks. How many of you are already on the purification list? The cult wasn't just planning to kill 63 people. It was chemically preparing them to die without resistance, ensuring that when Sterling Wolf or whoever Silas assigned came for them, they'd be too sedated to run, too confused to call for help, too trusting of the very organization that had sentenced them to death. The question of how many people on that list were already marked for death kept me awake that night. But waiting for answers would kill them faster than Silas could. We needed to see the indoctrination compound, with our own eyes understand the full scope of what my son had built. Willa walked through the doors of the Sunrise Psychological Wellness Center the next afternoon, disguised as a middle-aged woman seeking grief counseling, and what she found inside made 847 chemically controlled adults look like the beginning, not the end. I watched from a surveillance position 300 yards away, parked behind an abandoned grain silo with binoculars and a long-range camera. The wellness center sat isolated on 12 acres of rural Hamilton County land, single-story structure, modern construction, professional signage that would pass any casual inspection. Willa wore a wire. I heard everything. The reception desk was staffed by a young woman who greeted Willa with practiced warmth. "Welcome to Sunrise. Are you here for an appointment? I called yesterday," Willa said, maintaining her cover story. "I'm interested in grief counseling. I lost my sister 6 months ago." "Of course. Please have a seat. Dr. Morrison will be with you shortly." I listened as Willa moved into the waiting area. Silence for 30 seconds. Then her breathing changed, became shallow, controlled. She was seeing something. "There are schedules posted everywhere," she whispered, barely audible through the wire. "Rigorous, hour by hour. And the doors, they're soundproofed. Steel frames, no windows." I adjusted the binoculars, scanning the exterior. She was right. The building had almost no windows, except the front entrance. For a wellness center supposedly focused on outpatient therapy that was architecturally suspicious. The staff. Willa continued, her voice tighter. "They're wearing uniforms, but no state ID badges. Every legitimate facility requires visible identification." I made notes on my pad. Regulatory violations. Not enough to shut them down, but enough to establish pattern. Then Willa's voice changed completely. "Luther, in the waiting room. 2 children, no older than 10. Sitting perfectly still." My blood went cold. "They're not moving," she whispered. "Not fidgeting, not looking around. Just staring at the wall. Eyes unfocused. Like they're sedated." I closed my eyes. Children. They were targeting children. Willa maintained her cover for another 15 minutes, met briefly with an intake coordinator, then declined to schedule and left. I watched her walk to her car, drive the planned route, and meet me at the rendezvous point 2 miles away. She climbed into my vehicle, shaking. "Those children," she said. Luther, they weren't just sitting still. They were empty, like someone had scooped out everything that makes a child a child. You're sure they were there with cult members? The woman sitting with them had the same flat affect I saw in Astrid, same chemical slowness. She wasn't their mother, she was their handler. When they start targeting children, the investigation stops being about justice and becomes about war. I drove us back to Carmel in silence. Willa stared out the window, and I knew she was seeing those two motionless children on repeat the same way I would be for weeks to come. That night, an encrypted message arrived from Finn. Subject line, pattern confirmed. I opened the attached file at my desk. 23 names. 23 deaths over the past 3 years, all officially ruled suicides. Finn had cross-referenced them against cult intelligence from Thea and Astrid. Every single victim had been a recent defector. Every single one had died within 2 weeks of leaving the organization, and every single case had been closed with abnormal bureaucratic speed, no extended investigations, no family interviews, no toxicology follow-ups beyond standard protocols. I pulled up Detective Knox Bentley's jurisdiction history from public law enforcement databases, checked each suicide against the assigned investigating officer. Bentley. 23 cases. 23 times Knox Bentley had been the first responder, the scene assessor, the investigator who signed off on the suicide determination. Statistically impossible. No detective in a metropolitan area handles that specific cluster of similar cases unless they're being deliberately routed to him. I cross-referenced further. In every case, Bentley's initial report had been filed within 6 hours of body discovery, unusually fast for suspected suicides, which typically require extended scene investigation. In every case, families had raised concerns about inconsistencies that were dismissed. In every case, toxicology reports either came back clean or weren't ordered at all. These weren't suicides. This was an organized execution system with law enforcement cover. 23 people, 23 murders disguised as suicide, all bearing one detective's signature. I pulled up my master investigation file and added a new entry. Detective Knox Bentley, age 45, Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department, Tier 3 cult enforcer, accomplice 23 counts of murder. I stared at those names glowing on my screen. 23 people who had believed in something, tried to walk away, and were slaughtered for wanting their lives back. Some had families. Some had children. All of them had trusted that when they reported concerns to police, they'd be protected. Instead, they'd reported to their executioner. I called Willa into the office. She appeared in the doorway, still pale from the afternoon. "We need a larger hammer," I said. "Local law enforcement isn't just compromised. It's actively complicit in killing anyone who tries to escape. Bentley isn't just looking the other way. He's signing murder weapons disguised as death certificates." "What kind of hammer?" I pulled up a contact I'd been researching for 2 days. Callum Frost, investigative journalist with a national syndicate. He'd written 3 articles in the past year about anomalous suicide clusters in the Midwest, statistical outliers that didn't match demographic patterns. He'd been tracking the same bodies I was just now discovering. "Media," I said. "We need public pressure. Someone who can expose this simultaneously with law enforcement action, so Silas can't bury it before arrests happen." Willa read the screen. "You trust a journalist." She said, "I trust leverage. And right now, the only leverage we have is making this too public to suppress." I stared at Detective Bentley's name in my file, at the number 23 beside it, at the faces of 2 motionless children I'd never seen but would never forget. 31 days until December 15th, and my son had already killed 23 people I knew about, which meant the real number was almost certainly higher. I contacted Callum Frost the next morning. He agreed to meet within 48 hours, neutral location, no digital trail. The speed of his response told me he'd been waiting for someone to connect the dots he'd been mapping for months. The journalist sitting across from me at the roadside diner 2 days later had been tracking the same anomalous suicide cluster I'd uncovered, and he was about to become the hammer I needed to bypass every corrupted institution in my son's pocket. Callum Frost. 45 had the sharp, weathered intensity that comes from years chasing stories the powerful want buried. He slid a manila folder across the diner table toward me. Inside were printouts of his unpublished investigation, 23 deaths, statistical analysis, showing clustering that defied demographic probability interview transcripts with families who'd been stonewalled by local police. "I've been tracking these suicides for 18 months, Callum said. The patterns screamed cover-up, identical circumstances, accelerated case closures, families asking questions that never got answered. Then your name surfaced through my source network as someone asking similar questions. I studied his analysis. It matched Finn's data perfectly. Why haven't you published? Because I couldn't prove the connection. Suspicious pattern isn't evidence, it's conspiracy theory until you can demonstrate mechanism. I had the bodies. I didn't have the organization behind them." He leaned forward. "Until now." "I have the forensics," I said. "Financial trails, witness testimony, organizational architecture, 4-tier hierarchy, 847 people under chemical control. 23 confirmed murders disguised as suicides. A hit list with 63 names and a December 15th deadline." Callum's expression didn't change, but his pen moved faster across his notepad. "And I have the platform to make it impossible to bury. National syndicate, editorial independence, legal team that specializes in pre-publication review for stories targeting powerful interests. When I give you the signal," I said, "how fast can you publish?" "Simultaneously, across 47 outlets within 2 hours. Print, digital broadcast partners. Once it's live, they can't kill it fast enough. The story becomes unkillable." We shook hands across the table. Callum would hold the explosive story, continue his independent investigation, and wait for my signal. When the moment came, he'd launch a coordinated media dump that would make every attempt at suppression futile. "One question," Callum said before leaving. "The cult leader. You said his name was Silas Prescott." "Yes, same last name as you." I met his eyes. "He's my son." Callum absorbed this without visible reaction. "Then you know this ends one of 2 ways. Either he goes to prison, or you do, because the moment this story breaks, everyone will ask why you waited." I waited," I said quietly, "because I needed proof that would survive his lawyers, his money, and his 3,000 believers. Gut feeling doesn't convict murderers. Evidence does." Mid-third week, Willa and I were reviewing surveillance imagery Finn had compiled of the cult's key operatives. She stopped on one photograph, a woman in her early 40s, professional attire, standing outside a university administrative building. "Luther." Willa said, her voice strange. "I know her." Dagny Ashford, 41, stared back at us from the surveillance photograph, and the recognition in Willa's eyes told me this was no random cult recruiter. "This is Dagny," Willa continued. "She was my student 15 years ago. Graduate seminar on organizational psychology. Brilliant girl, absolutely brilliant. But she'd suffered terrible trauma, bullying, family abuse. She dropped out before finishing her thesis. I pulled up Finn's intelligence file on Dagny. Current role, head recruiter, targeting vulnerable college students. Tier 2 operative. Responsible for bringing in approximately 60 new members over the past 3 years. Shikti, he studied us, I said slowly. Silas mapped our vulnerabilities long before we even knew what he was building. Dagny wasn't a random recruitment, she was selected because of her connection to you. Willa's hands trembled. If he prepared this deeply, we're playing on his board. The question is, how far does the board stretch? My son hadn't just built a cult, he'd been studying me for years, mapping every vulnerability, recruiting weapons designed specifically to break my family. End of the third week, I conducted a routine counter-surveillance vehicle scan in a supermarket parking lot. Professional habit from decades of fieldwork: sweep for tracking devices, check for surveillance, verify you're operating clean. I found it affixed to my car's undercarriage. Magnetic mount, industrial-grade GPS tracker, the kind that costs $2,000 and requires professional installation. Not commercial retail technology. This was law enforcement or private security grade. It had been there for days, maybe weeks. I crouched in the parking lot staring at the device in my palm. Professional grade. Battery life of 6 months. Real-time tracking with geofencing alerts. Silas knew everywhere I'd been, every meeting, every surveillance position, every contact. My first instinct was to crush it under my heel. Destroy the surveillance, reclaim my privacy. Then I stopped. In chess, the most dangerous move is the one your opponent doesn't see coming, and Silas had just handed me his eyes. I could remove the tracker and let him know I'd found it, forcing him to deploy new surveillance I might not detect. Or I could leave it intact and weaponize it deliberately, feeding him false data, showing him movements I wanted him to see, leading his attention exactly where I needed it, while the real investigation happened elsewhere. I reattached the tracker to the chassis exactly where I'd found it. Then I drove to 3 locations in rapid succession: a coffee shop where I sat for an hour doing nothing, a bookstore where I browsed, without buying a park where I walked 2 loops and left. Random, pointless movements. Establishing a pattern of wasted surveillance hours. Let him watch me do nothing. Let him think I was floundering, gathering no intelligence, building no case. Let him feel confident while I worked in shadows he couldn't see. That night I held the knowledge of that tracker like a weapon. My son thought he was watching me, cataloging my movements, predicting my next step, staying 3 moves ahead. But he'd made one fatal assumption that I wouldn't notice. And in 35 years of hunting criminals, I'd learned that the moment someone thinks they're invisible is the moment they become most vulnerable. I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror and spoke aloud to the tracker I knew was recording my vehicle movements. My son thinks this is his leash, I said quietly. But starting today, this is my bait. For 3 days after discovering the tracker, I used it exactly as planned, leading Silas's surveillance to coffee shops, libraries, grocery stores. Pointless errands, while the real investigation happened, through encrypted channels and face-to-face meetings his GPS couldn't track. I was building my case in shadows, and he was watching me buy milk. Then Astrid handed me something that changed everything. 4 weeks into my investigation, she sat at my kitchen table with a pencil and sketch paper, drawing a building schematic from memory. When she slid it across to me, she said the words I'd been praying for: "This is where he keeps the files that own everyone." Willa and I leaned over the diagram. A commercial storage facility, 3-story structure, unit number labeled clearly at the top. "Shut Unit 347, 3rd floor," Astrid said. Before he locked me in that basement, I handled administrative logistics for 6 months. Part of my role was maintaining the auxiliary safe documents too sensitive to keep at the compound. "What kind of documents?" I asked. Astrid's expression was grim. "Extortion material, video, audio, financial records, judges taking bribes, police captains covering evidence, real estate developers involved in fraud, politicians with underage—" She stopped. "People who can't touch him because he owns their secrets. Mutually assured destruction files. That's his real protection, not just Detective Bentley, but an entire network of compromised officials who'll burn if he burns." I studied the schematic. "How do we access it?" Yeah, the storage contract is under a shell identity, Marcus Holloway. The same name from the purification list. The dead man from entry 7. Silas was using corpses' identities for operational security. I memorized the access codes before he confined me. 6 digits 847293. Willa looked at me. If we get that drive, Shakiku. We cut the strings holding his entire legal shield. I finished. Every judge, every cop, every official protecting him, they all become liabilities instead of assets. We hand it to federal authorities, they verify the contents, and suddenly Silas loses every protection he's built. For the first time in 4 weeks, I allowed myself to believe we might actually win this. The storage facility was 40 minutes northeast of Indianapolis, deliberately remote from any registered cult properties. Industrial area, minimal security, the kind of place where people stored things they wanted forgotten. Willa and I arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, November 28th, 2 days after Astrid drew the schematic. I'd spent those 48 hours planning every detail surveillance sweep of the facility, backup extraction routes, counter-surveillance protocols to ensure we weren't followed. The GPS tracker on my car showed me driving to a dental appointment in Carmel. In reality, we'd switched vehicles 3 blocks from my house using Willa's car that Silas had no reason to monitor. The facility's front desk required only the shell identity name and access code. The clerk, a bored college student wearing earbuds, barely looked up as he handed us the elevator keycard. "Third floor unit, 347, he said. "You've got 2 hours before we close." We rode the elevator in silence. My heart rate was elevated, controlled, but elevated. This wasn't just evidence. This was the nuclear option. The files that would dismantle Silas's entire protection network in one move. The hallway on the 3rd floor was concrete and fluorescent lit. Unit 347 was midway down, identical to 50 others, except for the number stenciled on the door. I unlocked it. Inside was a 10 by 10 space, mostly empty except for a commercial-grade floor safe in the far corner, heavy steel biometric lock overlay, covering a traditional combination dial. Astrid had warned us about the biometric layer. He added it 6 months ago, but the mechanical combination still works if you know the sequence. The biometric is backup security, not primary. I knelt beside the safe, began entering the sequence she'd memorized. 847293. The mechanical tumblers clicked smoothly. Lock disengaged. I pulled the heavy door open, expecting to see an encrypted hard drive, maybe file folders, USB storage devices. Instead, nothing. Empty, completely impossibly empty. Not even dust. The interior had been wiped clean, recent cleaning, judging by the faint chemical smell of industrial solvent. "Sir Luther," Willa whispered. He knew. I stared into the hollow steel void. My mind was already racing through implications. Silas had cleared this safe. Not months ago. Recently. After Astrid told us about it. Which meant he knew we'd extracted her. Knew she'd talked. Knew we'd come for this exact target. He didn't just know we were coming, I said quietly. He cleaned it out and left it empty specifically for us to find. This is a message. Willa's face was pale. "What message?" "I see everything you try." We left the facility in silence. I drove. Willa was shaking too hard. The GPS tracker on my primary vehicle would show me still at the dental office, maintaining the false narrative. But my mind was elsewhere, tracing intelligence chains backward. The safe's existence was known to exactly 4 people: Willa, me, Astrid, and Thea Mercer. Thea, the former Tier 2 disciple I'd found through my insurance database. The woman who'd defected 6 months ago and provided the cult's complete architectural blueprint, 4 tiers, safe house locations, the Sunrise Psychological Wellness Center's legal registration. Everything she'd told me had checked out. Independently verified through Finn's research, through Astrid's testimony, through observable patterns. But verification means nothing if the source is feeding you partial truths, designed to pass authentication. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and stopped the car. Sat staring through the windshield at nothing. "What are you thinking?" Willa asked. I traced the timeline. "Thea defected 6 months ago," she said. But what if she hadn't? What if the defection was staged? What if Silas had planted her in my path, deliberately knowing I'd find her through my database? Knowing I'd trust intelligence from a supposed escapee? Every piece of information she provided had been designed to sound credible, while leading me into exactly this kind of trap. She'd given me targets that existed, just not valuable ones. Intelligence that was accurate but incomplete. Enough truth to build trust, enough lies to control the investigation. "The safe information came from Astrid," I said slowly. "But Thea knew we'd extracted Astrid. She was at our meeting 2 weeks ago when I mentioned we'd rescued my daughter-in-law. And the only way Silas knows we targeted this safe is if someone told him Astrid was talking." Willa's eyes widened. "You think Thea—" I turned to face her, and the pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. "The defector," I said. "She's a double agent." I sat in the car outside the storage facility, hands shaking so badly I couldn't turn the ignition. Thea Mercer, traumatized survivor, my key witness, my only advantage had been Silas's puppet all along. Every document she'd copied, every password she'd surrendered, every terrified confession had been scripted. I hadn't rescued her from the cult. I'd been handed her like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Willa drove us home. I spent the ride on my phone pulling up Finn's surveillance archive, cross-referencing timestamps against the narrative Thea had sold me. She'd claimed to defect in May. Said she'd been living under the radar for 6 months, terrified of being found. But Finn's location data pulled from cell tower triangulation and public camera feeds told a different story. November 19th. Thea Mercer's vehicle was photographed entering the cult compound at 2:47 p.m., exiting at 4:12 p.m. November 19th, 4 days before I even knew her name. Before I'd found her in my insurance database. Before I'd approached her at that highway diner. I called Willa the moment we got home, put her on speaker while I pulled up more footage. "You thought you turned her," Willa said, her voice flat. "But she was already turned back. That's Tradecraft 101 Luther. They let you think you won. I found more." Security footage from a coffee shop 3 blocks from my office, dated November 29th, the day before I'd accidentally encountered Thea outside a grocery store. The footage was grainy, time-stamped 2:18 p.m. Thea sat in a corner booth, hands wrapped around a mug she never drank from. Across from her, a woman in her 50s, auburn hair, wearing a dove-gray scarf I recognized from compound surveillance photographs. Sterling Wolfe, second in command. They didn't speak. The handler slid a phone across the table. Thea read something on the screen, instructions, coordinates, my photograph, then nodded once and slid it back. 47 seconds total. Then Thea left. The next morning, November 30th, I'd, coincidentally, run into her outside the grocery store on Maplewood Avenue. "He seated her in my path," I said aloud. "Planted her where I'd find her. Made her look authentic enough to pass verification. Then everything she gave you is contaminated." Willa said, her voice turning cold. The December 15th date, the warehouse locations, the member list, the 4-tier structure. It's all theater. I stared at my investigation files. 4 weeks of work. Hundreds of hours. All built on intelligence from a source who'd been controlled from the beginning. "Not all of it," I said. "Astrid's testimony is independent. Finn's financial data comes from hard sources. The 23 murders are documented. But anything that came through Thea is designed to lead you exactly where Silas wants you to go," Willa finished. I was still processing this when the doorbell rang at 9 p.m. No car in the driveway. No sound of approach. Just the bell. I opened the door to find an unmarked manila envelope on the welcome mat. No postage. Hand-delivered. Inside was a handwritten card on expensive stationery. "You're doing exceptionally well, Dad, S." And beneath it, a USB drive. I brought it to my office, ran it through Finn's malware scanner clean, then plugged it into my isolated laptop that had no network connection. One file. Video. Encrypted, but the password was embedded in the file name father.mp4. I opened it. Silas appeared on screen, sitting in what looked like the compound's library. Leather chair, bookshelves behind him, and there, visible on the second shelf, a first-edition copy of The Psychology of Obedience, the same book I'd written my graduate thesis on in 1982. He'd placed it there deliberately, a visual footnote. His hands were folded. His expression was calm, almost gentle. "Hello, Father," he began. "I wanted to have this conversation face-to-face, but given your current state of operational security, I thought a recorded message would be more appropriate." He shifted slightly, and I realized he was reading from notes. November 24th, 9:47 a.m. You photographed my license plate at the housewarming party. November 26th, you hired a surveillance team. I identified them within 6 hours. November 30th, you approached Thea Mercer outside a grocery store in Carmel. Very smooth, by the way. I almost believed you'd found her organically. My chest tightened. December 8th, you met with Callum Frost at a roadside diner. Investigative journalist. National syndicate. Excellent choice for media leverage. He smiled. December 10th, you conducted a raid on the warehouse at 1247 Industrial Drive. You found 16 people in various states of pharmaceutical dependency. What you didn't know is that I'd withdrawn the other 43 exactly 12 hours prior to your arrival. Did you wonder why the doors were unlocked? He paused as if waiting for me to answer. I permitted your investigation, Father, because I required you to comprehend something fundamental. You were never the predator in this equation. You were always the subject. Every move you believed was surveillance was in fact performance. Every victory you celebrated was a data point I'd already cataloged. You've been my behavioral study, a real-time analysis of how a trained investigator responds when the target is his own son. I watched the video 3 times. Silas never raised his voice. His cadence was professorial, detached. When he listed my actions, he didn't gloat, he cataloged them. Like a researcher documenting a subject's responses to controlled stimuli. The video ended with a freeze frame of his face. His expression wasn't triumphant. It was patient. Waiting. I checked the file metadata, recorded 2 hours ago. 2 hours ago. Which meant Silas had known I'd discover the empty vault tonight, before I'd even arrived at the storage facility. He'd timed this message to arrive precisely when I'd be most vulnerable to its impact. As the video player closed, a new file auto-opened on my desktop. Text document. Single line. Intercept.exe. I clicked it. A map interface loaded. Real-time GPS tracking. A single moving dot traveling south on Route 37. Timestamp 9:43 p.m. Current speed 55 miles per hour. I recognized the route immediately. County prisoner transport. The schedule was public record for security reasons, and I'd checked it 3 days ago when Astrid had been transferred from my protective custody to county lockup pending federal processing. The van was scheduled to arrive at the main detention facility at midnight. Standard armed transport. 2 officers, 1 prisoner. The file name blinked. Intercept.exe. I looked at the clock. 9:47 p.m. 43 minutes to decide. Intercept the transport and extract Astrid, exposing my position, burning operational security, potentially walking into an ambush. or let her reach the facility and trust that federal protection would hold. Silas was giving me a choice, but the choice itself was the trap because either option served his purpose. I made the call. Midnight came and went. Astrid reached the detention facility under federal protection without incident, which meant either Silas had been bluffing about the intercept or he'd gotten what he wanted from forcing me to make the choice at all. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I was sitting on a frozen park bench, 93 minutes past the scheduled rendezvous time, watching an empty pavilion where a Tier 4 council member was supposed to hand me the cult's central financial ledger and disappear into federal witness protection, except he was already gone in a way neither of us had planned. The park was isolated, chosen for exactly that reason. Medford, 30 miles from Indianapolis. No cameras, no foot traffic in December. The kind of place where two people could meet, exchange materials, and vanish in opposite directions without leaving digital traces. I'd received the encrypted coordinates 48 hours ago through a back channel I'd cultivated over 3 weeks. A man inside the cult's financial operations, Tier 4 council, responsible for managing offshore accounts, shell company disbursements, money laundering infrastructure. He'd approached me indirectly after reading Callum Frost's unpublished suicide cluster investigation. Said he had the complete ledger. Said he wanted immunity. Said he'd meet me here at 7 a.m. December 13th. It was now 8:33 a.m. The pavilion remained empty. My phone buzzed. Encrypted message from Finn. The hospital log, John Doe. Route 9 single vehicle 4:47 a.m. steering column sheared clean through. That doesn't happen on a 2021 sedan. I read it 3 times. Route 9. The main highway leading from the compound to Medford. My asset would have taken that route to reach the park. And at 4:47 a.m., 12 hours before our scheduled meet, someone had engineered a catastrophic mechanical failure. Pronounced dead at 6:15 a.m. Finn's follow-up message read, admitted as John Doe. No ID, no one's claimed the body yet. I stared at the empty pavilion. He'd been coming to me, had trusted that federal immunity would protect him, that I could extract him before Silas discovered the defection. But Silas had known. Of course he'd known. Sterling Wolfe had surgical timing 12 hours before the meet, early enough that the death would blend into morning traffic statistics, late enough that I wouldn't hear about it until after I'd already wasted hours waiting. Every asset I touched turned into a liability. Every door I opened, Sterling had already nailed shut from the other side. The park bench was iron-painted green decades ago, now flaking rust through the enamel. My hands were numb, not from the cold, but from gripping my phone for 90 minutes, waiting for a text that would never arrive from a man already in the county morgue under a Jane Doe tag because no one had claimed the body yet. I drove back to Carmel. Willa and Finn were waiting in my office when I arrived, Finn on video screen, Willa pacing. He's dead, I said without preamble. Sterling got to him 12 hours before the meet. Willa stopped pacing. Luther, we have a bigger problem. Finn's face on the screen was grim. I ran a deep background sweep on regional FBI personnel. Standard protocol: verify which agents might be clean enough to approach with your case. What I found instead, he pulled up 2 personnel files. Special Agent Cordelia Hines, Financial Crimes Division. Special Agent Marcus Vey, Organized Crime Unit. Both joined the Bureau in 2016. Both appear in cult compound intake logs from 2014. Tier 2 initiates. I felt something cold settle in my chest. They're not corrupt. They're true believers. Been embedded for years, Finn confirmed. Not recent recruits, not people Silas bought with money or blackmail. These are disciples who joined law enforcement specifically to protect the organization from investigation. Willa moved to the screen. Every tip you've called in, every warehouse raid request, every surveillance warrant you've tried to file through normal channels, it's all been routed through their desks first. You weren't working with the FBI, Luther. You were reporting directly to Silas. I pulled up my case log. 4 weeks of attempted federal coordination, requests for surveillance authorization, tips about suspicious deaths, warnings about the cult's pharmaceutical pipeline, all filed through regional FBI offices, all handled by either Hines or Vey. None had resulted in action. How many layers deep does this go? I asked quietly. 2 agents, you confirmed. But what about their supervisors, their analysts, the clerks who route the paperwork? Finn shook his head. I can't verify beyond Hines and Vey without triggering alerts. But Silas doesn't plant 2 seeds and call it a garden, he cultivates infrastructure. Willa sat down heavily. So local FBI is completely compromised. Local police we already knew about Detective Bentley. What's left? I opened my old Rolodex, physical address book. 35 years of contacts accumulated across fraud investigations, insurance cases, corporate security consultations. I flipped through looking for federal connections outside Indiana. One name stood out, Garrison Webb, Chicago Field Office. We'd worked together on the Kellerman arson fraud case in 2008, 15 years ago. He'd been a junior agent then, eager, sharp, willing to pursue leads other investigators dismissed. I'd helped him build the case that made his career. He'd told me if I ever needed anything, call. I pulled up his contact information. Direct line to Chicago FBI field office. Chicago, I said. Webb owes me from the Kellerman case. He's the last door left that Silas hasn't wired shut. Willa looked skeptical. You haven't talked to him in 15 years. Some debts don't expire. I dialed. The line rang 4 times. I was preparing to leave a voicemail when a voice I hadn't heard in 15 years answered. Webb. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. Garrison, it's Luther Prescott. I need a federal task force mobilized in 48 hours, and I need you to assume everyone in Indiana is compromised. Silence on the line. Then, how bad? I stared at Finn's screen showing Hines and Vey's photographs, 2 smiling FBI agents who'd spent 8 years protecting a murderous cult from federal investigation. Worse than Kellerman, I said, and the clock's already running. Webb listened to my explanation for 11 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, he said one word, evidence. I told him I had it. He told me to get on a plane to Chicago tomorrow. Tonight I had other work. Finn's encrypted file hit my screen at 11:34 p.m., a single spreadsheet with 18 months of wire transfers that rewrote everything I thought I understood about Silas's operation. The cult wasn't self-funded. It was venture-backed. I opened the secure video link. Finn appeared on screen already pulling up documents. I traced the financial anomalies you flagged, he said. Member tithes, donations, pharmaceutical revenue, they cover operational costs. But there's a separate income stream that doesn't match any internal source. He shared his screen. Wire transfer logs. 14 transactions over 18 months. Total value $2.3 million. Originating entity Archstone Ventures Limited, registered in Georgetown, Cayman Islands. Finn highlighted the company name. Shell Corporation, 3 layers deep. But the deposit rhythm is methodical every 6 weeks like clockwork. 40,000 here, 200,000 there. Always offshore, always laundered through legitimate business fronts before landing in cult accounts. I studied the pattern. Professional money laundering. Not the amateur hour you'd expect from a regional cult scraping together tithes. Member tithes fund operations, I said slowly. This is external capital. Someone's investing in Silas's infrastructure. Who banks a cult unless they're expecting a return? So that's the question, Finn replied. I traced Archstone back as far as I could legally go. It connects to a venture capital network with ties to... He paused. Luther, this gets into geopolitical territory. Defense contractors, private intelligence firms, think tanks with State Department connections. My chest tightened. You're telling me this isn't just Silas building a cult. Someone wanted him to build it. Someone wanted him to scale, Finn corrected. Gave him the financial runway to expand from 200 members to 3,000. Funded the pharmaceutical pipeline. Bankrolled the real estate acquisitions. This isn't religion, Luther. It's a geopolitical instrument. Someone's using Silas to destabilize domestic infrastructure, recruit law enforcement, compromise judicial systems, create chaos. Archstone Ventures Limited wasn't a name. It was a shell, a matryoshka doll of limited liability corporations nested inside offshore trusts, each layer designed to obscure the handwriting, the checks. Can you identify the ultimate source? I asked. Not without triggering federal financial surveillance alerts, Finn said. But I can tell you this, whoever's behind Archstone has deep pockets and long-term strategic goals. They didn't invest $2.3 million in Silas for profit. They invested it for effect. I saved the files to my encrypted drive and closed the link. Sat staring at the financial data for 20 minutes. My son wasn't just a cult leader. He was a proxy weapon for something larger. Before I tell you what Webb said when he saw the full evidence, are you still with me? Comment A if you think Luther should wait for backup, or B if he should act now and add one reason why in 5 to 10 words. A quick note: what follows includes some adapted details to convey the urgency of this moment. The core truth is what matters. I flew to Chicago the next afternoon, December 14th. 24 hours until the deadline Silas had set, if that deadline was even real anymore. Webb had reserved a corporate hotel suite downtown. Neutral ground. No surveillance. When I arrived at 2 p.m., he was already reviewing preliminary files I'd sent ahead. Garrison Webb, 47, looked older than I remembered. 15 years in federal law enforcement had added gray to his temples and lines around his eyes. But the sharp intelligence I'd worked with on the Kellerman case remained. He stood when I entered. We shook hands. Luther, you look like hell. 4 weeks hunting my own son will do that. I laid out the complete master file across the conference table. 4-tier organizational structure. Financial flows including the offshore backing. 63-person hit list. Dr. Greer's prescription fraud operation controlling 847 people. Detective Bentley's 23 false murder reports. The embedded FBI agents Hines and Vey. The shadow syndicate financing. Webb studied it for 40 minutes, asking questions, cross-referencing documents, verifying sources. Finally, he sat back. About 4 tiers, offshore financing, embedded FBI agents, a hit list, and a December 15th operational deadline. He looked at me. Luther, this isn't a cult investigation. This is domestic terrorism with international funding. I need federal assets in Indiana by tomorrow night, I said. Local FBI is compromised. Local police are compromised. If I wait for normal bureaucratic protocols, 63 people die and Silas disappears into the same network that funded him. Webb stood paced to the window. I can mobilize a multi-jurisdictional task force, coordinate with ATF for weapons seizures, Treasury for the financial crimes, DOJ for the RICO prosecution. But Luther, he turned to face me. This takes time, clean warrants, isolated command structure to prevent leaks. I need 72 hours minimum. I have 24. Then we do what we can in 24. He pulled out his phone, started making calls. I'll have tactical teams staged by tomorrow morning. But you need to understand something. If we breach that compound prematurely without proper legal authorization, every piece of evidence becomes challengeable. Silas walks on technicalities. So what do I do? Wait while he executes 63 people? Webb's expression was hard. You wait for my teams. No matter what. Don't breach that perimeter before federal assets arrive. You go in alone, you're giving Silas legal cover to eliminate witnesses and claim self-defense. You'll destroy the case and get people killed. Webb's warning landed like a gavel. Don't breach the perimeter. Wait for backup. Follow protocol. Every word was tactically sound and strategically impossible because waiting meant trusting that December 15th was a bluff, and I'd stopped believing in Silas's bluffs the moment I saw that empty vault. I left Chicago with Webb's assurance that federal teams would deploy by December 15th morning. The flight home took 90 minutes. When I landed at Indianapolis International at 8:45 p.m., I turned on my phone. One voicemail, Willa, time-stamped 40 minutes ago. I listened to it standing in the airport terminal. Her voice was tight controlled. Luther. Astrid called from county lockup. She says Silas moved the timeline. It's not December 15th anymore, it's tonight. I checked my watch. 9:17 p.m. December 14th. At 9:17 p.m. on December 14th, standing in the parking lot outside Portland International, I had two choices: call Agent Webb and tell him I'd wait for the federal teams to mobilize or drive straight to the compound and do what 27 years of fraud investigation had trained me to do: get eyes on the scene before the evidence disappeared. I made the call. Webb didn't answer. I left a message saying I was heading to the perimeter for reconnaissance, only then started driving north. But the pieces that forced my hand that night, the ones that turned a father's desperate hunch into a federal case, had fallen into place 6 days earlier when Astrid Bauer asked to meet at my house instead of the county lockup conference room. She arrived on December 8th at 3 p.m. escorted by a deputy who unlocked her cuffs at my front door and told me he'd be parked at the curb. Astrid walked into my living room like she owned it, scanning the bookshelves and the framed photos of Silas as a boy before she sat down on the couch and said, "You think I'm the insurance policy. I'm not. I'm the bomb." I asked what she meant. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket. The deputy had cleared it and handed it to me. It was a handwritten list of server URLs, encryption keys, and timestamps. "Dead man's switch," she said. "Every session with Dr. Greer, every financial transfer, every video from the compound basement. If I don't reset the timer every 72 hours, it uploads to WikiLeaks, the FBI, and 23 journalists. Silas doesn't know the backups exist. Elena does. She helped me set them up. I studied the list. The URLs were offshore hosting services, the kind that didn't cooperate with subpoenas. I asked why Elena Greer would help her sabotage her own research. Astrid smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Because Elena isn't loyal to Silas. She's loyal to her data. And she knew if he ever turned on her, she'd need proof she was following orders, not leading. That was the first crack in the wall I'd been trying to scale for weeks. She stayed for 2 hours, walking me through the encrypted archives. There were 47 recorded sessions between Dr. Greer and compound members dated from June 2021 to November 2023. In the earliest files, Greer's voice was clinical detached, administering cognitive tests, recording physiological responses to controlled stressors. By mid-2022, the language had shifted. She stopped using terms like participant and subject and started using responsive, suggestible, optimal. In one session from August 2023, I heard her tell a 24-year-old woman named Iris that the medication she was taking, something called AX14, not FDA approved, would help her release attachment to conventional moral structures. Iris asked if there were side effects. Greer said only clarity. I asked Astrid if she'd ever taken AX14. She nodded. For 8 months. It didn't make me suggestible. It made me compliant. There's a difference. Suggestible means you can be talked into something. Compliant means you stop asking why. She left my house at 5 p.m. The deputy cuffed her again and drove her back to lockup. I sat at my kitchen table with the list of URLs and a legal pad writing down every name she'd mentioned, every date, every detail that didn't fit the profile of a small-scale Oregon cult. By December 9th, I had Finn cross-reference the archived financial transfers with the $2.3 million Cayman wire he'd flagged earlier. He called me at 11 p.m. with results I didn't want to believe. The money didn't originate in the Caymans, he said. It passed through. Origin points are Delaware, Nevada, Wyoming, 12 different LLCs across 8 states. They're all shell companies, but the filing agents are real. I ran the names. 4 of them have ties to psychiatric research, 3 to real estate development, 2 to private security firms. I asked how many states total. He paused. If I include the secondary signatories and the properties listed as collateral, 12. Luther, this isn't a compound in Oregon. It's a network. That was the second crack. On December 10th, I drove to Fisher's to meet Dr. Elena Greer in person. I didn't tell her I was coming. I waited outside her private practice until she finished her last appointment at 6 p.m., then followed her to her car in the parking garage. When she saw me, she didn't look surprised. She looked resigned. Astrid told you, she said. I asked if the research was sanctioned. She unlocked her car, set her briefcase in the passenger seat, and turned back to me. Sanctioned by whom? The IRB that rubber stamps anything Silas's attorney files, the medical board that hasn't audited a private practitioner in Lane County in 4 years. I've been documenting unconsented human experimentation since 2022, Mr. Prescott. Astrid's Dead Man's Switch isn't the only copy. She handed me a USB drive from her coat pocket. Lab records. Blood panels, neuroimaging, adverse event reports I was told to classify as unrelated incidents. 17 people have been on AX-14 for over a year. 6 have developed arrhythmias. 3 have early markers for kidney failure. Silas calls it spiritual refinement. I call it poisoning. I asked why she stayed if she knew. She looked at me like I'd asked why water was wet. Because if I leave, someone else takes over. Someone who won't keep records. Someone who won't build a case. By December 11th, I had everything I needed to take to Agent Webb, Astrid's Dead Man's Switch, Greer's lab records, Finn's financial map, Willa's testimony about the December 15th timeline. I flew to Chicago on the 13th and laid it out in Webb's office in 90 minutes. He listened without interrupting, then made a call to someone he introduced as Commander Halsey, FBI Critical Incident Response. Halsey conferenced in from Quantico. Her voice was flat, efficient. Mr. Prescott, if your data analyst's network map is accurate, we're not looking at a cult. We're looking at 3,000 people across 12 states, many of whom don't know they're part of a coordinated structure. If Silas is planning a mass casualty event for December 15th, he's not acting alone. I felt the floor drop out. When Commander Halsey said 3,000 people across 12 states, I felt the case shift from containment to crisis. But the operational reality didn't change. Federal teams couldn't mobilize until December 15th at 6 o'clock, and by then Silas would have executed whatever he'd been building toward. So I made a choice that 27 years of fraud investigation had taught me was sometimes the only option: get inside before the window closes. The forged credentials, laminated badge reading Tier 3. Observer Sector 9 got me past the first security checkpoint at the Geist Reservoir House gates, but the second guard scanned it for 3 seconds too long, and I knew I had maybe 5 minutes before Sterling Wolf's security protocol flagged the duplicate serial number. The guard looked up from the scanner, expression flat. Sector 9, you're a long way from Montana. What brings observation protocol to Oregon? I kept my voice neutral, bureaucratic. Cross-sector audit. Apex directive for December 15th operational alignment. He studied me for another 2 seconds, then waved me through. I walked up the gravel path toward the main house, at exactly the pace someone with legitimate credentials would walk. Not hurried, not casual, just purposeful. My hand stayed loose at my side, fingers brushing the concealed camera Finn had embedded in a pen clipped to my jacket pocket. The device was recording at 1080p, streaming to an encrypted cloud server Webb's team could access the moment they arrived in the morning. If I could get visual documentation of the assembly, the federal case would have evidence no defense attorney could argue away. The main house's rear entrance led to a vaulted auditorium I hadn't seen in the compound blueprints Willa provided. Someone had converted what looked like an old conference hall into a tiered theater rows of benches descending toward a central stage, industrial lighting rigged to spots that made the platform glow like an operating room. 400 bodies in identical gray tunics seated in perfect rows. No talking. No movement. Just waiting. This wasn't a congregation. It was a formation. I positioned myself in row 32, back third of the room, and sat down between a man in his 50s and a woman who couldn't have been older than 23. Neither acknowledged me. Their eyes stayed locked forward, hands folded in their laps, breathing synchronized to some rhythm I couldn't detect, but felt in the silence. The badge hadn't been questioned. The seat hadn't been challenged. For 60 seconds, I let myself believe the cover was intact. Then the lights dropped. A single spotlight hit the stage, and Silas walked into it like he'd been born there. He wore the same gray tunic as everyone else, but the way he carried it, shoulders back, chin-level gaze sweeping the rows, with the precision of a surveyor marking property lines, turned fabric into uniform. He stepped to the microphone at center stage and let the silence stretch until it became pressure. Commitment to the design, he said, voice smooth, unhurried, requires clarity. Clarity requires truth. And truth, he paused. His eyes swept the auditorium row by row, scanning faces with the same systematic focus I'd used 1,000 times in interviews looking for the tell, the break, the single wrong detail that didn't belong. The auditorium smells like industrial carpet and vetiver incense, clean, controlled, deliberate. No perfume, no cologne. 400 people breathing in synchronized rhythm, and the only sound is the HVAC system circulating air at 68 degrees exactly. I can feel the woman next to me inhale for 3 counts, hold for 2, exhale for 4. The man on my left does the same. They're not just sitting in rows. They're operating as a system. Hapgon requires naming what hides in plain sight. Silas's gaze locked onto row 32, onto me. He smiled. Tonight, he continued, voice carrying through the mic with perfect clarity. We are honored. My father, Luther Prescott, retired investigator, architect of resistance, has joined our rouse. The words landed like a flashbang in a closed room. 400 heads rotated in unison, not fast, not startled, just synchronized, practiced, inevitable, and locked onto my position. The man beside me didn't blink. The woman's expression didn't shift. They just turned, stared, and waited. I didn't stand. I didn't move. My hand stayed on the pen in my pocket, camera still recording, because even trapped, I could document, and documentation was the only weapon I had left. Silas stepped closer to the edge of the stage, mic in hand, gaze pinning me like a specimen under glass. Stand, father. Let them see you. I stayed seated. The silence thickened. Somewhere behind me, a radio crackled, soft, professional, controlled. Sterling Wolf's voice, low but audible in the soundproofed stillness. All perimeter points locked. Subject contained. Awaiting apex directive. The exits had just sealed. Silas tilted his head, the gesture so familiar It triggered a memory. I didn't want him at 9 years old, asking why I missed his school play. That same tilt of the head, that same patient disappointment. "You came here to observe," he said. "So observe. But understand you're not watching the design anymore. You're inside it." He turned back to the assembly, addressing them now, not me. "My father believes he's documenting evidence. He believes federal teams will arrive tomorrow and dismantle what we've built. He believes exposure equals defeat." Silas smiled again, wider this time, and the spotlight caught the edges of his teeth. "He doesn't understand that exposure is the point." 400 faces turned back to the stage in unison. Not a single person whispered. Not a single person shifted in their seat. The HVAC cycled. The lights hummed. Silas stood at the center of it all, microphone live, eyes bright. And I realized with the cold clarity of someone who'd just walked into a trap he'd seen coming but couldn't avoid, he'd known I would infiltrate. He'd counted on it. This moment, my presence here exposed before the assembly, wasn't a failure of my plan. It was the centerpiece of his. 400 pairs of eyes, not hostile, not curious, just waiting. Like I'm the next slide in a presentation they've already memorized. Silas doesn't break eye contact. The microphone captures his voice with perfect clarity. "My father has joined our rouse." Sterling Wolf stands at the rear exit, hand on his radio exits sealed. "I'm not an infiltrator anymore. I'm an exhibit." Silas extended his hand toward me from the stage microphone, amplifying every syllable to 400 witnesses. "Father, join me." And I realized he wasn't asking for reconciliation. He was staging a coronation with my legitimacy as the crown. He kept his hand extended, palm up, patient. The spotlight held him in perfect focus. 400 pairs of eyes waited. Sterling Wolf stood at the rear exit, blocking the only path out. "You've dedicated your life to exposing fraud," Silas said. "I've built something beyond fraud. I've built clarity. Join me, Father. Not as adversary, as architect. Show them that even you see the design." He doesn't want my agreement. He wants my surrender. He wants me to validate him before 400 people who believe he's infallible. And if I refuse with words, he'll counter with rhetoric. So I give him silence. I stood from the bench and met his eyes across 30 rows of gray tunics. I looked for the boy who used to ask me why insurance fraud mattered, the 9-year-old who built Lego cities and wanted to be an architect. I didn't find him. I found a stranger wearing my son's face, holding a microphone like a scepter. I turned my back, not dramatically. Just a simple rotation, shoulders, hips, feet, and I stepped into the aisle heading toward the exit. The auditorium stayed silent. No gasps, no murmurs. Just 400 people breathing in rhythm and the hum of the HVAC. Behind me, Silas's voice cut through the silence. "You're walking away from your son." I stopped at the threshold. I didn't turn around. "I lost my son years ago. I'm walking away from a stranger." Then I kept walking. Sterling blocked the corridor 20 feet ahead, flanked by 2 enforcers, both over 6 feet, both carrying tactical posture that said former military. His hand rested on his radio. "Mr. Prescott," he said. "You entered this facility as a guest. Departure requires Apex authorization. Return to the auditorium." I stopped 3 feet from his position. My phone buzzed once Willa's signal that she was monitoring the audio feed from the pen camera still recording in my jacket. "Stand aside," I said, "or explain to a federal judge why you're holding a witness against his will." Sterling's radio crackled. A voice. "Perimeter alert. 2 vehicles approaching main gate. Federal markings." The federal SUV's headlights cut through December fog at the compound gates, 2 cones of white halogen turning mist into solid geometry, and Sterling's radio crackles with static as his options collapse into binary comply, or commit felony obstruction on federal recording. A megaphone voice, calm and authoritative. Sterling Wolf, this is FBI Tactical. Stand down and release Luther Prescott immediately, or you will be charged with federal witness intimidation and felony obstruction. Sterling stood motionless for 3 seconds. His hand hovered over the radio. Behind me, the auditorium stayed silent. Then Sterling stepped aside. I walked past him through the exit corridor across the gravel path to the gates where 2 black SUVs idled with headlights blazing. A woman in FBI tactical vest handed me a thermal blanket and said, "Sir, you're clear. We're extracting you to Chicago Field Operations Command." Your wife coordinated the intercept. I looked back at the main house. The windows glowed with soft interior lighting. 400 people inside, still seated, still waiting. My son somewhere on that stage watching his father leave under federal escort. I got in the SUV. By 11 p.m., I was standing in an FBI Field Operations Command Center in Chicago. Wall-mounted screens displaying live satellite feeds, agents working phones and laptops, tactical maps pinned to whiteboards, with red circles marking 12 locations across the continental United States. Agent Garrison Webb, 47 years old, 22 years with the Bureau, the kind of career investigator who'd seen enough mass casualty near misses to take cult threats seriously, stood at the center addressing federal leadership. 12 targets, 6 a.m. synchronized entry. Webb said, laser pointer marking the map. Oregon Apex plus Montana, Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, Virginia, and 6 secondary hubs. We intercept transmission infrastructure before activation codes deploy. A TF handles armory seizures, Treasury freezes offshore accounts, Homeland coordinates state-level arrests. Astrid sat at a corner workstation with 2 federal technicians walking them through the dead man's switch protocols. Authentication resets every 72 hours. She said. If the raids fail and Silas initiates purification, this goes live automatically to DOJ and 47 news outlets. It's your insurance policy. Finn worked 3 laptops simultaneously, routing encryption keys to field teams who'd need to bypass compound security systems at 6 a.m. across 4 time zones. Callum Frost, 42-year-old investigative journalist, for a national syndicate, the reporter who'd broken the offshore LLC story 3 weeks earlier, sat in the back row drafting headlines for the 6:01 a.m. publication that would hit newsstands the moment federal teams secured the compounds. Willa stood beside me watching the command center coordinate what would become the largest simultaneous cult raid in federal history. She'd orchestrated my extraction, called in Chicago field office contacts, and turned a retired investigator's hunch into a multi-agency operation. I look around the command center. Willa marking target maps. Astrid briefing technicians, Finn routing encryption keys, Webb coordinating 12 state offices, Callum drafting headlines, and realize I've spent 40 years investigating fraud alone. But I'm ending the largest case of my career, surrounded by people who chose to stand when they could have walked away. The wall clock reads 11:47 p.m. Webb's voice cuts through the command center. All units final comms check at 0500. Tactical deployment 0530. Breach authorization 0600 sharp. Willa stands beside me, hand on my shoulder, and says what I already know. No matter what happens, we did what was right. In 6 hours and 13 minutes, 12 federal teams will breach 12 compounds simultaneously, and my son will either surrender or ignite the network he's built. At exactly 6 a.m. on December 15th, 12 federal tactical teams detonated flashbang breaches across 12 compounds in 12 states simultaneously. I watched the Oregon Apex compound's vaulted doors explode inward on Agent Webb's live tactical feed from a command center 4 states away, knowing my son was inside. 12 wall screens erupted with synchronized chaos armed agents pouring through smoke and shattered door frames, shouting commands over the percussion of breaching charges. Webb stood at the command podium with a radio headset coordinating across 4 time zones with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this for 3 straight days. All teams breach authorization green. Execute, execute, execute. Montana, Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, Virginia. 6 secondary hubs I'd never heard of until Finn's financial map revealed their infrastructure. Every compound hit simultaneously. Every entry team moving with identical choreography, flashbangs, formation room clearing restraint. Willa stood beside me with the same analytical focus she'd used to audit corporations 40 years ago. Astrid sat at a workstation to my left, monitoring radio traffic marking arrest confirmations on a digital grid. Her hands stayed steady on the keyboard, but her jaw tightened every time the Oregon feed showed another gray-tunic disciple being zip-tied toward federal transport. First confirmation. At 6:04 a.m. Sterling Wolf detained at the rear perimeter mid-escape wearing running shoes. The enforcer who'd eliminated witnesses, staged accidents, and closed every door I tried to open was taken down face first on asphalt in a parking lot, like a common fugitive. At 6:07 a.m., the Virginia feed showed Dr. Elena Greer being handcuffed in what appeared to be a medical clinic. She didn't resist. The moment the cuffs clicked, she said 5 words, "I invoke counsel, full proffer." Astrid leaned back from her monitor. She's already negotiating. Silas trained them too well to be loyal. At 6:11 a.m., Detective Knox Bentley, who'd filed 23 false obstruction reports protecting cult operations, was arrested on his own precinct floor by Internal Affairs. His badge stripped, his weapon secured, walked past officers who'd trusted him for years. His face stayed blank. His hands shook. At 6:13 a.m., Dagny Ashford was apprehended on a university campus mid-recruitment, surrounded by federal agents, while students recorded on their phones. She smiled for the cameras like she was accepting an award. 47 arrests in the first 11 minutes. Callum Frost's exposé hit global news wires at 6:15 a.m. Headlines scrolled across the media monitor: Federal raids dismantle 3,000-member national cult syndicate. Oregon spiritual leader faces capital murder charges, but Silas hadn't been found. The Oregon feed showed agents clearing room after room, dormitories, conference halls, the vaulted auditorium where I'd stood less than 12 hours earlier. Empty. The stage where Silas had extended his hand and invited me to join him was abandoned. Then, at 6:45 a.m., a tactical officer's voice crackled over the Oregon Channel. Subject located. Main auditorium stage. Approaching broadcast terminal. All units converge. The feed switched to a helmet-mounted perspective agent, advancing through the backstage corridor, rifle raised toward a single silhouette, standing against the central broadcast terminal. Silas. Fingers 6 inches from the activation sequence that would transmit execution commands to 3,000 operatives across 12 states. 5 federal rifles tracked his chest. Silas Prescott, step away from the terminal. Hands visible. You are under federal arrest. He raised his hands, slowly turned toward the tactical line, with that practiced, serene smile, styling himself as martyr, the enlightened leader persecuted by an unenlightened state. Gentlemen, you've interrupted morning meditation. I assume you have proper documentation for this theatrical entrance. He'd been arrested before in smaller jurisdictions, always released within 48 hours. The smile held patient and unbothered until the agent reached the final charge. Certainto. Capital murder in the first degree for the assassination of federal witness Victor Hayes. You are facing the federal death penalty. 38 years of cultivated control disintegrated in 3 seconds. The serene mask cracked. His jaw tightened. His eyes darted left for an exit that didn't exist. He wasn't a prophet anymore. He was a man facing lethal injection. As agents turned him toward the exit, his gaze cut through the tactical line and locked onto the command center camera directly at me 4 states away. Still calculating. Even now, even in handcuffs, he was running scenarios. The agent pulled him toward the door. Silas mouthed 2 words I could read perfectly on the screen. Not finished. At 6:58 a.m. on December 15th, Astrid sat in the FBI command center, watching the dead man's switch timer count down 2 minutes until the 72-hour window expired and 700 megabytes of evidence auto-deployed to 47 outlets simultaneously. Agent Webb stood beside her workstation, arms crossed. Astrid, reset it now. Once it deploys, we lose prosecutorial sequencing authority. She kept her eyes on the countdown. 73 seconds. 72. No. Silas built this network on secrecy and elite protection. If I hand it to DOJ alone, it gets plea bargained into redactions and sealed testimony. The public needs to see exactly who financed him and why. Let it burn clean. Willa stood behind me, hand on my shoulder. 45 seconds. 30. 15. At 7 a.m. exactly, the screen flashed green. DOJ, the New York Times, Washington Post, Reuters, ProPublica, and 42 others receiving the archive simultaneously. Extortion videos. Elite member identities, sitting senators, state commissioners, federal contractors. Offshore trust networks funneling money through 12 state shell companies. Dr. Greer's unredacted conditioning protocols documenting systematic chemical manipulation of 847 individuals over 3 years. It's done, I said. Astrid, you just ended his myth. She closed the laptop with a quiet click. End of file. The federal coordinator briefed me on December 18th. Youngest victim, 19, oldest, 62, average chemical dependency duration, 14 months. Families of 23 individuals previously ruled suicides received notifications that cases had been reclassified as active homicides based on cult enforcement records recovered from compound servers. On December 21st, I sat across from a woman in her mid-50s at a federal briefing center in Michigan. Her daughter had jumped from a campus parking garage 3 years earlier. The coroner ruled it depression-related suicide. Enforcement logs now entered into evidence showed Sterling Wolfe had been present on campus that day. Recovered surveillance footage showed him following her to the garage. She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. They told me my daughter jumped because of depression. For 3 years, I believed I missed the signs. Now you're saying she was murdered because she tried to leave a cult I didn't even know existed. Now your daughter tried to protect you by keeping it hidden, I said carefully. That's what they conditioned her to do. It wasn't your failure. It was his design. She nodded, once stood and walked out without another word. Grief doesn't get smaller with answers. It just changes shape. By late December, Willa and I had listed the family home in Carmel. Not because of shame. Not because of media attention. Because every door frame, every corner, every measurement mark on the wall was poisoned by what Silas had become. We required an uncompromised foundation. On December 28th, I stood in the empty living room watching winter light move across bare hardwood floors I'd installed 31 years ago. Willa walked through the kitchen one final time, stopped in the doorway, and looked at me across the vacant space. Every room is a question I can't answer, she said. When did we lose him? Was it 3rd grade high school? Or was he already gone before we knew to look? I walked to the doorframe where we'd measured Silas's height every birthday until he turned 12 and stopped letting us. The pencil marks were still visible, faint lines labeled with dates and ages. I carried him across this threshold when he was 3 days old. I thought I was building a home. I didn't realize I was watching something grow that I didn't understand. Willa locked the front door for the last time and handed me the key. You've spent 40 years investigating fraud, looking for patterns, motives, evidence. But sometimes loss isn't a case to solve. Sometimes loss just requires you to look at it, name it, and walk away. We turned toward the rental car. We weren't closing a case. We were starting a life that didn't have him in it. The first morning in the Michigan City cottage, I woke to silence. Not the tense silence of waiting for catastrophe, but the simple quiet of a house that held no history, no measurement marks on door frames, no ghosts of a son I couldn't save. Willa was already on the front porch with black coffee and a handwritten notepad. I poured my own cup and joined her. 1,200 square feet, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, windows, facing frozen Lake Michigan. The realtor had apologized for the size 3 times during the walkthrough. We'd signed the lease the same day. This is exactly right, Willa said, not looking up from her notepad. We don't need space to fill. We need space to breathe. The cottage was significantly smaller than the Carmel home, a deliberate choice, not a financial constraint. We no longer required expansive rooms designed for family gatherings and childhood milestones. We required something simpler and more honest. And I've been thinking about what you said at the old house, I told her. That sometimes loss just requires you to look at it. I looked. I saw a son I couldn't reach, and a life I couldn't fix. Now I'm looking at this frozen lake, empty cottage, no case files, and I think maybe that's enough. Willa turned the notepad toward me. The page was divided into neat sections. Garden plans for April, a trip to Montreal in June, the bistro we'd loved in 1987, before the investigation, consumed everything. Names of friends we'd stopped calling when every conversation became an interrogation about our son. The final entry underlined twice, forgive ourselves. Not for failing to save him, she said quietly. For believing we ever could. 3 weeks later, Astrid met us at a small coastal cafe in Michigan City. She looked different, not physically, but in how she carried herself. Shoulders back, eyes clear. The woman who'd been chained in a basement 4 months earlier walked in like she owned the air around her. She ordered tea, sat across from us, and set a folder on the table. The National Alliance for Coercive Control Survivors offered me the director role, she said. 18-state network. Policy advocacy, legal support, deprogramming resources. I start February 1st. Willa gripped her hand. You were chained to a basement wall 4 months ago. Astrid smiled. Not the practiced performance smile I'd seen on Silas's face, but something genuine and earned. I was. And then I cloned a server, built a dead man's switch, survived federal witness protection, and detonated an archive that exposed 3,000 operatives across 12 states. Now I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure no one else gets trapped the way I was. Hi, you were the strongest element in the entire investigation, I said. Not me, not Willa, not the federal teams. You built the failsafe. You chose when to detonate it. You're the one who actually won. She shook her head slowly. I didn't win, Luther. I survived. And survival isn't victory. It's refusal to let the damage define the outcome. That's all any of us can do. Survive, refuse, rebuild. She stood to leave, hugging Willa first, then me. She smelled like hotel soap and winter air, nothing like the compound, nothing like captivity, nothing like the investigation. Just clean and forward-moving. Thank you for not giving up on me when I couldn't give up on myself, she said to Willa. Willa held her a long moment. You gave up on yourself exactly 0 times. We just stood nearby while you fought. Astrid walked out onto the pier, shoulders straight, stride, purposeful, no hesitation. At her car, she turned once and raised her hand. Not goodbye. Acknowledgement. Willa watched until the taillights disappeared. She's going to make it, not she'll be fine. not she'll recover. Just she's going to make it. I nodded, because Astrid would build something that protects people the way no one protected her. And that is the only kind of justice that survives courtrooms. The phone rang at 11:43 p.m. on a December night, rain hammering the cottage roof like accusations. An automated voice announced a collect call from Silas Prescott Federal Detention Facility. I'd been waiting for it since the moment they put him in handcuffs. I accepted the call. His voice came through smooth, unbroken, without apology. He said he regretted nothing, that the logic of what he'd engineered was sound, the methodology precise. Then he asked the question I hadn't anticipated. Do you ever think you were the one who erred? I looked out at the storm battering Lake Michigan. Lightning flickered over the water. Willa stood in the kitchen doorway watching me, not speaking. Yes, I said finally. I erred every day I failed to see you drowning while sleeping under my roof. I erred when I taught you to see patterns in fraud, but never taught you to see value in people. I erred when I chose case files over bedtime stories. I'll carry that until I die. Silence. Not dead air. I could hear him breathing, recalculating. That's not the answer I expected, he said. I know. You expected me to defend my investigation. But this isn't about investigation anymore. It's about a father who missed every signal his son was dying inside. Does admitting your error change anything? I thought about the 847 victims. The 23 families who'd learned their children's suicides were actually homicides. Victor Hayes dead in a staged accident. Astrid chained in a basement. 3,000 people across 12 states conditioned to execute mass casualty orders on command. No, I said. It doesn't change what you built or what I had to dismantle. It just means we both failed in different directions. You failed to become the person I hoped you'd be. I failed to see it happening in time. Then why confess it? Because you asked, and because I'm done lying to myself. He exhaled, not a sigh, just breath. Goodbye, Father. Goodbye, Silas. On January 7th, I walked out to the porch at dawn, carrying my leather-bound investigative journal, 35 years of fraud cases, patterns, identified perpetrators brought to account. I opened it to the final blank page and wrote his name, Silas Prescott. Beneath it, subject investigated. Network dismantled. 847 victims recovered. File concluded. For 35 years, I'd closed every case with 2 words, case closed. Every fraud solved. Every ledger balanced. I couldn't write them. I sat with the pen, motionless, staring at his name in my handwriting. The same script that had marked his school enrollment forms, his birthday cards, the measurement lines on the Carmel doorframe when he was 7 years old and still becoming someone. Willa stepped onto the porch barefoot despite the January cold and sat beside me without asking for explanation. She looked at the open page. You left it open, she said. Some files don't close. They just stop demanding attention. Is that enough? I set the journal on the bench and left it there. Lake wind caught the pages, turning them forward and back, his name visible one moment, hidden the next, then visible again. Not erased, not emphasized, just there. Willa's hand found mine. The sun cleared the frozen lake at 6:52 a.m., cold and clean, and I understood at last that justice doesn't always mean resolution. For 35 years, I believed closing files was the whole of my purpose. But the only case that ever truly mattered was never about ledgers or evidence. It was about a boy I loved and a man I couldn't save. Some things you don't conclude. You simply put them down and learn to call that enough. And to you listening to my story, remember this. Don't make my mistake. I spent 40 years investigating fraud building cases, closing files. But while I was teaching my son to see patterns in evidence, I never taught him to see value in people. I chose case files over bedtime stories. I failed to see him dying inside while sleeping under my roof. That's a wound no amount of family justice can heal. This story isn't like other dads' revenge stories you might have heard. I didn't win. I dismantled a network, saved 847 lives, brought my son to justice. But I also lost him forever. The lesson: not every question demands resolution. Sometimes the pursuit of family justice means accepting that you can't save everyone, not even your own child. I believe God put me through this to teach me that putting down an unresolved wound is itself a form of victory. Some files stay open. That's okay. If this story moved you, I'd be grateful if you'd share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in my position? This isn't like most dads' revenge stories. There's no clean victory here. If stories like these resonate with you, please consider subscribing to Wise Revenge and sharing this with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for staying until the very end. Just one final note. Some details in this story have been fictionalized for storytelling purposes. What matters most is the message, and I hope it stays with you.